Hello. So, welcome to the Psychological Professions Week. So this is our second slot of the week, and it's going to be an overview of what the psychological professions and the network's doing in your region. And I think the primary focus of this afternoon is going to be on leadership. So I really hope you enjoy it. The Slido should be open, and please do put your comments and your questions in those, and we'll certainly have a bit of time at the end to pick them up, even if we don't have the opportunity beforehand. So without any further ado, I'm just going to provide you with a brief introduction of what the psychological professions networks are. I expect this will be familiar to many of you. So yeah, I've said all that. Oh yes, the other thing is, if the session's being recorded, if you don't want your name to appear, please post anonymously in the Slido. And there'll be more information at the end of the session about how you can access this information going forward. So moving forward, I've said all that, and I think the main thing I suppose I wanted to highlight was this will focus on what we do around informing, enabling and influencing people to make the best use of the psychological professions across the country. So what is the Psychological Professions Network? It's a network that connects all the major stakeholders in psychological professions. So it's for all of us psychological professionals. It's for all stakeholders such as members of the public, service users, carers, staff, managers, commissioners and more. And for connecting all the professional bodies that support psychological professionals as well. And I think the summary is it's intended to be a bridge. It's a network. It connects people. But what it isn't is it's not a professional body. Professional bodies are really important. They set standards for their members, they accredit and advise and training, and the Psychological Professions Network's really draw on that information to share it more as widely as possible. Neither is it a trade union. We have trade unions and they're there to support things around terms and conditions of employment, including pay, as many of us all know. And I think the other thing is it's also not a body led entirely by the agenda or interests of its members. Because the Psychological Professions Networks are supported by Health Education England, a lot of our work relates to improving workforce, improving access to psychological professions. So we do work very closely in terms of their agenda. That's not to say that innovation isn't part of what we do, or suggesting things to the system about what we do isn't part of what we do. So it's also not a network representing mental health. It's primarily focused on psychological professions, and again, many of you listening will be aware that the psychological professions don't just work in mental health, they work across community settings, acute hospital settings, in public health, in universities and so forth. And we want to include everyone in that. And I think this is where I started. So the mission is, when we started this journey about 8 years ago, was that we joined together to inform both the strategic stakeholders and our members around key areas. And I think the other thing as well is we seek to enable our members to engage with each other and relevant partners in supporting collaboration and promotion of evidence-based practice across the whole health service. And I think that's also very important in the sense that we've not always had as big a voice as it would have been helpful to have. So supporting our members to take on some of that voice and develop their voices in terms of what's important is part of our remit. And having that voice, we really want to influence policy, practice and organisations to ensure that psychological approaches are embedded within health and social care for all. There's a link on the slide, which obviously you won't be able to access just now, but we'll be able to access later or via our website, which is at the top left there. And then in 3 minutes and 18 seconds, there's a very succinct description of who we are and what we do. If you haven't seen it, I'd certainly recommend it. It's worth watching. Haven't quite got the hang of this clicker yet. Oh, there we go. So we started off in the Northwest some years ago, but how many PPNs have we got? So there's now the Southeast, and I'm sorry, there's a typo in that. It should say Southwest. Apologies to my colleagues in Dorset, Devon, Cornwall, and so on. The Midlands, Northeastern Yorkshire, London, and the East of England as well. So that's all 7 regions of England that now have psychological professions networks. You could say that doesn't really map some of the boundaries that you're used to, but this is the way that the NHS and Health Education England operates. So we're aligned to those boundaries because that makes most sense in terms of how NHS and commissioning and planning are organised. And I think finally, what's the point of all this? So what can the regional psychological professions networks achieve? I think creating a community of practice and infrastructure to support chief psychological professions officers, you'll hear a bit more about those in a minute, to deliver the England psychological professions vision. And I think it's about joining up so that we can actually support policy making and workforce planning from a regional level. While there's similarities in terms of some of our workforce challenges, say in London and the Northwest, they're not always completely the same. So actually having regional voices is really important. And I think promoting greater understanding and recognition of all the psychological professions is very useful. And I think I mentioned at the beginning, innovation is really useful as well. And I think there have been a range of projects that have supported that innovation. And you will hear a little bit more about those this afternoon, and you'll certainly hear a lot more about them for the rest of the week. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Estelle Moore, who's the Psychological Professions Network London Chair, to tell us a bit more about the role of the Chief Psychological Professions Officer.
Thank you so much, Geeta. That's brilliant. So yes, picking up the theme of information and informing about the role of psychological professions, just a section on what is a Chief Psychological Professions Officer. So next slides, thank you. Oh, hopefully, yeah, thank you. So picking up that theme of influence, in only 2019, and it seems so much further back in time, but a number of psychological professional bodies, including the BPS, British Psychological Society, joined together to call for the creation of a Cppo, a Chief Psychological Professions Officer within NHS England, bringing the leadership of psychological professions workforce to be much more in line with other professions such as medicine and nursing. And since the establishment of the regional psychological professions network, as Geeta has just described, all UK-wide 7 regions of those, they have been generating a wider network of the regional senior leaders across regions. So we've got not only presence at NHS England and the voice at a national level, but also thinking regionally. So we'll tell you a little bit more about those roles on the next slide. Why do we need Cppos? In light of growing demand in society for better access to psychological therapies and the fact that increasing access to these services is vital for delivery of the long-term plan, the strategic plan to ensure that people can get access, leadership makes a really important contribution to that blueprint for the future of the NHS. So the long-term plan offers important opportunity for us towards parity of esteem, for making sure that mental health is viewed in the same light and given the same resources as physical health. And given that the landscape of the NHS is changing, we do need a leadership structure which has got local pertinence, local relevance, a regional presence, and that national voice. Thank you. The next slide. Who can be a Chief Psychological Profession Officer? So it's an overarching leadership role and an organisational role that's executed by somebody holding at least a master's degree in psychology or a related field of expertise. Usually that person's an experienced clinician or a person who has management or service transformation experience and or programme leadership experience. Someone who can assess and understand the work, have a working formulation about the impact on the workforce of decision making and procedures made by board level teams. So it's sort of sitting in the structure of the delivery of healthcare as it's commissioned. So the Cppo is typically a professional with an established network of psychological experts to draw on and whose expertise can be called upon when needed. I think it's also worth noting that it's a fairly new term. So in a lot of trusts and organisational structures, we still use the terms like head of psychological therapies, sometimes director of therapies, head of psychology and psychotherapy. Those terms are also used. Thank you. Next slide. So what does a Cppo do? It's a chief role because this person will have a mandate, if necessary, to go against proposals of other chief level, C-level executives when he or she may know or can argue that a suggested direction or change will not result in the desired or planned outcome in terms of behaviour for the workforce or impact for an organisation. So a person is able to challenge and ensure that psychological professions are certainly on the map and understood. So what qualities might be needed from an individual to be able to ensure that this happens? Well, it's likely that the person would need very well developed empathic skills, especially when it comes to predicting behaviour or the response of target groups to change and innovation. And this is a skill that's developed by means of clinical and managerial experience, as I noted earlier, may also relate to the person's personality, and a firm knowledge of scientific theory and research is to be able to draw on. And the next slide. So it's not a solo role, obviously, as Gita's describing. We're thinking in the networks of developing communities of practice. It's a role that is aligned with a range of teams, both within an organisation and outside a primary organisation. It's a role that requires integration of knowledge, so some disciplines with which psychological practices play a significant part, so drawing information together. And also addressing quality, constantly signalling and proactively reviewing improvement and development as a primary responsibility. Not to say that that's implemented personally by this individual in an organisation, but certainly having oversight and collaboration with others. It's really important to be formulating strategy and considering accountability in the psychological professions and doing our best to shape a healthy culture both within and between organisations and teams. I think that is my last slide. Oh no, one more. So the case for further evolution of the Cppo role, I guess the nitty-gritty, and I think we're going to hear more about this shortly from leaders. So professional leadership remains a challenge in our current systems because we're on the cusp of moving from, I guess, developing and evolving. At present, there isn't necessarily clear lines of representation into boards for all the lead psychological professions. So it's really interesting to be beginning to think about, well, who's representing whom at what level. And so it's really important that we keep working at that and really thinking about what the psychological professional leadership voice has to offer and why it's so important to our patients and service users and carers that we consistently deliver with influence. It's really important to be inclusive of all the psychological professions, and it's really, really valuable for Cppos to work together across organisations. Just to reiterate, it's absolutely essential for the Cppos expertise to be present to be able to deliver on the long-term plan. And I think that was my last slide as I hand back to Gita. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. So I was just going to take a few minutes because I think Estelle's given a really, really helpful overview of why the sort of Chief Psychological Professions Officer role is so important. And I think one of the ways it's certainly becoming very important is thinking about workforce planning. Here we go. So very briefly, I mean, I suppose in terms of there are definitions of workforce planning in all sorts of places, and they are more or less complicated. But I think fundamentally, I think from an NHS and public sector point of view, it's the right people, the right skills at the right time to deliver NHS services. And clearly, anyone who's been, I suppose, watching the media over the last few weeks, there's a lot about NHS vacancies. There's a lot about the pressures and demands of the system. And I think some of that certainly relates to challenges around getting enough staff to do the right things at the right time. Now, clearly, the psychological professions networks aren't there to solve all that, but just thinking about our own world and those services that we offer that people want. I think the NHS long-term plan, there's a lot in there about expansion and the new roles for psychological professionals. We currently have 12 psychological professionals providing psychological approaches across a range of populations, a range of services, a range of different types of interventions. And I think there's ongoing work around developing new roles. And if you come and join us on Wednesday as a brief trailer, you'll be able to hear a lot more about those. But there's challenges around that in terms of data and information, which are related, but not always as clearly as we might like. So some of the examples is we have 12 psychological professions, but they're not always coded in our electronic staff record in a consistent or coherent way. And part of the role of the Chief Psychological Professions Officers is to be able to understand that data and advise people and provider organisations about how that should be best done and how it could be improved. I think there's also something about the assumptions people make about who is needed to deliver a service. And sometimes those are our assumptions. We can sometimes default to what we know best. But I think using data and using that information and using an understanding of all the roles can help us contribute to this in a kind of more consistent and coherent way. And I think that's the thing, is where can we contribute to the process? And that can be at a local trust level, that can be at a regional level, or that can be through some of the work that goes on with the National Psychological Professions Workforce Group. So that's just a bit of an example. And I think it's also now sort of time to move on. So at this point, I get to hand back to Estelle to talk us through and share some examples around mentoring for leadership. Back over to you, Estelle.
Thanks again, Geeta. So just in the theme of enabling and celebrating, I guess, the work in various regions. So this is a celebration of some work that's been happening in London, the London region. And as Geeta mentioned earlier, the regions have different, the PPNs in the different regions have different history and length of being. And London is a much newer region to have been established, but its work on mentoring preceded the establishment of the PPN. So talking about mentoring, so the next slide, thank you. Focusing, oh yes, sorry, I've got some, you'll see in a minute, there's some experts on the experience of being mentored. We'll talk to us shortly. Sabrina Hussain and Layla Lawton, we'll come to those in a moment. Thank you. Yes, what is mentoring about? It's a wonderful process, really, where a person with some wisdom or experience in supporting, guiding and supporting another person, sometimes a younger person, not always. So it's really interesting in reciprocal mentoring, maybe have a different set of experiences to share. But we're thinking about the planets we heard about this morning, of the mission statement for the PPN, thinking in particular in this project about how we unite and increase diversity in the psychological professions, how we help our communities to thrive and get as close to them in terms of understanding and representation as possible, and how we put people first, and that might include our staff colleagues and their personal development. So this is a project that just talks to that agenda. Thank you. The next slide. So people may well know that leadership mentoring was an area that was sponsored by Health Education England. Just to give you a little bit of context, in December 2020, there was investment in 3 areas across the country: some paid opportunity schemes for aspiring clinical psychologists who have come from disadvantaged backgrounds or are carers themselves to gain clinical experience. There's also funding support to undertake accredited qualifying level family and systemic psychotherapy. And the one I'm going to focus on, or we're focusing on this afternoon, was around leadership mentoring and coaching opportunities for our colleagues from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and particularly with a thought to their aspirations to lead. Thank you. Next slide. So what I was so happy to discover as an incoming regional chair was that London was a region really rich already in mentoring schemes. So at the top of this slide, you'll see Kat Alcock, who is, must be credited with some fantastic work way back, even a decade ago, was working on looking at how there could be additional support for Black, Asian, mixed and Middle Eastern and North African psychology undergraduates and aspiring psychologists to come come into the profession. So Kat's work and research did a wonderful job of highlighting some of the complexities and difficulties in our profile the profile of clinical psychology as a profession in terms of diversity and equality, and has set up schemes to make a difference to that. So 10 years on, 2020-21, the scheme was now jointly funded by DCP London, the Division of Clinical Psychology London, and University College London, and is run on behalf of that region for the Clinical Psych training courses. And there's just one scheme that's enabling aspiring psychologists to develop relationships with both trainee and qualified clinical psychologists to really encourage individuals from minority ethnicities to feel welcome in the field of clinical psychology in a way that has been traditionally lacking. So thank you. Next slide. So as a region in 2020, the London Cppos, we're just talking about their role, as an example, they were ignited into action. We had a very strong response to the world events. So in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened to George Floyd, and the pandemic also highlighting inequalities. So we formed a diversity task and finish working group, and we were very energized at the time to make sure that psychological understanding and empathy was spread throughout the system. So initially, the story goes, London was initially allocated 14 leadership, coaching and mentoring opportunities. And then some additional funds from HEE expanded this to 83 places. And then an even more miraculous thing happened, and services supplemented HEE's funding in London so that we were able to offer 113 individuals, and not just clinical psychologists, but a range of psychological professionals, the opportunity to access coaching and mentoring sessions with people right across the capital. And actually, the mentors were across the country, so not just in London. Isn't that a fantastic, sort of expanding of a good initiative? So on the next slide, thank you. So we thought it'd be really helpful this afternoon to hear from the mentees themselves, and just to sort of highlight, to signpost you, just thinking about what is a great outcome from a mentoring program. Implementers who introduce mentoring schemes would hope to see some outcome changes in various areas. These are some just to highlight, because I think you'll hear them spoken about as Sabrina and Layla tell their story of their mentoring experience. But focus on things like personal skills, professional competencies, hopefully, ideally, some kind of career development and networking, and certainly a shared cultural understanding, and giving people opportunity to feel more confident in how they might do that and share their own expert knowledge of being them and being them in the workplace. So I think we hear that from from Sabrina and Layla, who will talk in a moment about their experience. So I think this is now for the film, if that's okay, Matt.
So just to introduce myself, my name's Sabrina. I'm a trainee clinical associate psychologist.
Hi, my name's Layla Lawton. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, and I'm working at Talking Therapies, Southwark.
My reason for becoming a mentee was to be able to develop leadership skills, especially in terms of building confidence and reducing my anxiety levels that I have in particular when speaking around others, especially when it comes to kind of public speaking. As a lot of the time I have struggled with different contexts, for example, role plays, delivering presentations. I also was looking into kind of building emotional resilience, especially in regards to things in my personal life and being able to kind of separate my professional self from my personal self. So I was approached to become a mentee by a member of staff, but this was in relation to being a member of a power, race and difference working group with leads from various different service lines. And the aim of this particular group was to develop some workshops with an external facilitator around building an anti-racist stance. So as a result, I was approached with regard to the work that I had done in this working group. So I was mentored by Dr. Anne Moreau, who has given me permission to use her name in this recording. And my experience of this mentoring program has been overall a positive experience. It was useful in being able to develop a clear plan to address personal and work life. I was able to develop a really kind of positive therapeutic relationship, but also a working relationship with Dr. Anne Moreau. We were able to have open, honest discussions, which were contained quite well. And it felt really good in terms of the level of empowerment that she gave me in these meetings, in terms of the questioning that she used around being able to figure things out on my own, and her being able to assist me and support me in that process. It was very structured, so we always had kind of agendas going into the meetings. So I would bring my topics and she would bring her topics, and then we'd build upon that together collaboratively. We also spoke about the different ways that I am leading in my current role, so opportunities to develop that personal skill and professional skill. We also spoke about the difficulties of being a carer. Personally, that has impacted my kind of time management, my capacity, but also my own well-being as well. So being a carer for my mum and being able to balance my own well-being and my mum's well-being at the same time.
I heard about the mentoring scheme late last year. There was an email and it really spoke to me. I think it came at a really good time. And I had to send an email just expressing my interest with some kind of context about my role and what I wanted to get from mentoring. So I think we kind of had to all apply. I was really grateful to be one of 2 people selected for the initial first round in our trust, South London and Maudsley.
In terms of the ways this mentoring program has impacted my career choices and development, we were able to, so my career aspirations are to get onto the doctorate in clinical psychology, and it will be my 3rd time applying this year. And I remember coming in to having that, so I remember bringing that discussion into the mentoring program with Dr. Anne Moreau and feeling quite defeated initially, just because of the difficulty of getting onto training. And I know that there's kind of the issues around HEE funding, which are kind of upcoming. But especially in consideration for diversity in clinical psychology, really wanting to be able to get onto this doctorate and make a change in any way that I can to have my voice heard in psychology, which is the true goal. But overall, I've been really grateful for the experience, and it's been really empowering for me. And I guess it's only motivated me more to continue in psychology and get onto the doctorate in clinical psychology and kind of not giving up despite having rejections along the way, and kind of normalizing that process has been really useful as well.
It's really hard to put into words what the space really meant. Over the course of this time, I literally don't really know what I would have done without that space. I'm thinking about leadership and how that looks and what that means for me, because we all bring something slightly different with our lived experiences, with our characters, with our personalities, and it's shown me how to be my authentic self more, and to step into spaces and own them. And yeah, I don't know what else there is to say really, in terms of the process, but it's been an anchor, it's been a support, it's been a platform, it's created opportunities that I intend to build on in other relationships, professionally and otherwise. So it's been fundamental to me in 2021, coming out of a 2020 which was like nothing any of us could ever predicted and expected, emotionally, professionally, personally. I'm so grateful to this scheme, and I just really encourage others to step up. And I too now would consider you know, how I might be able to mentor others, and continue with that same level of care, authenticity, and compassion that my mentor displayed with me, and that drive, and that honesty, and that integrity, and you know, those shared kind of characteristics which were integral to that psychological safety in our interactions. So yeah, thank you for the experience, and it's great that these programs are in existence now.
In terms of at work, this kind of involved more around contributing in MDT meetings, especially when I noticed those feelings of unease and feeling uncomfortable. It was quite useful to be able to look back on those meetings during times like these and just kind of feel the fear and do it anyway. I was also quite mindful, especially in regards to public speaking, about my stutter, which can come out at times. And I think that has inhibited me from speaking out a lot in front of other people and being quite conscious of how I speak. So being able to have an open, honest discussion with my mentor about this and the obstacles that I may face, we were able to problem solve ways to overcome these obstacles.
So it's taught me a lot about myself, actually. And it's been emotive at times, because for me, when I applied, I just had a quite close family bereavement. And I know a number of us in the workforce would be in the same boat, would, you know, given that we are in a pandemic, and given that there's a disproportionate number of people from racially minoritized communities that have been affected. I think everyone's been affected, but the statistics show that there's a high number of people that have died from my community and from communities of people of color. So yeah, it felt incredibly uplifting, and so important at a time where there was a lot of vulnerability. But what I learned from the experience is that even in that place of vulnerability, there can be amazing growth, you know, through the most difficult challenges and the most painful experiences. Growth can come out of it. And that's been my experience with my mentor. What it's gained for me is increased confidence in terms of where I go next, making sure that I'm defining who I am and what I bring, and being able to be reflective, and understand the systems and the processes that don't always fit for me, but trying to live within that and establish where there's areas that I can push, you know, and areas that I might need to refine.
Thank you. So wonderful to hear there from Sabrina and Layla. So I just also want to note that it's Dr. Amra Rowe, whose name is listed here, spelt as she would spell it, and Michelle Brooks Uchega, who were the mentors referred to there, but also all the other supervisors and mentoring schemes in the London region. If you wanted to look into that a little bit more, there's a YouTube site called Seeing is Believing, which is something that gives helpful information about some of the mentoring schemes on offer. You can tap into it once you receive the slides. So just a final takeaway tip then, in terms of coming back to our theme around, I suppose, the role of mentoring and the importance of leadership, and as we take that forwards in this session. Clearly, I think as we hear from our mentees, mentoring can be an extremely valuable process. And how, I think we heard there, how it really works for both parties, both mentor and mentee. Really plays a key part in a range of ways of getting the right support to address and respond to our struggles to create a truly diverse and representative workforce. So all part of the leadership agenda. I'm going to hand back, I think, to Geeta.
Thanks, Estelle, and thanks. I think that's been such an informative and really, really helpful presentation to see. And I think, great thanks to the mentees that have participated in that. So without any further ado, I can see sort of comments and questions coming in the chat, but we can pick them up in a little bit of time. So I'm going to hand over to talk about influence and the pilot project around leadership fellows in the Northwest. So it's going to be over to Rachel, Paul and Dale. And I think I'm handing over to Rachel first.
Hello everyone, good afternoon, and thank you, Geeta. Yes, it's great to have the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about our new roles as Leadership Fellows. My name's Rachel Damone. I'm the Associate Director for Psychological Professions for Pennine, Lancashire, and I work for Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust. And I'm unsurprisingly, the Leadership Fellow for Lancashire and South Cumbria. And my colleagues, Paul and Dale, will introduce themselves to you as we move through to their slides shortly. So I'm going to kick off our short session just by giving a bit of an overview of the role, really, and the expectations of us in these roles. And then Paul and Dale are going to move into some detail and actually ask some questions from you, get some feedback from you, because that's really important to us in our roles. Okay, so what are we expected to do? What does the job description say, if you like? So crucially, we really need to understand who our chief psychological professions are. Estelle talked about those roles a little bit earlier. And that will involve regional mapping of those roles and of other senior leads for each of our areas. And when we understand those roles, we're going to work with our Northwest PPN chairs, as in the Northwest case, and our programme manager to look at developing a leadership plan. Really important, we want to ensure, again, this has been alluded to already in previous presentations, that we want to ensure that full range of the 12 psychological professions views are heard and represented, and they're really included in our thinking and our planning. I think historically there was quite significant inequity, and there continues to be significant inequity around leadership across all of those roles. And I would say, as a neuropsychologist, that I'm going to stealthily add neuropsychology is the 13th psychological professional group. So the key aim really is to move our leads nearer to the action, to really get us to the decision makers, I suppose, and in particular, offer that influence around workforce planning, so that our input can be really felt and experienced at those high level negotiations at that sort of regional ICS footprint level where it's missing quite often. And again, as has been mentioned before, that we work together, as leads work together to ensure the best outcomes for everyone. That might involve the use of pointy elbows, as I think Geeta once said to me. So, moving on. I'm going to go back, sorry, Ron, it's not Paul quite yet. So I've just added on the bottom of there a link to a paper. It's a really useful paper, actually, that it talks about management and leadership for our psychological professions. So training, competencies, diverse and inclusive leadership. It's a really good read if you haven't seen it all already. So that's just we've got a fairly short session. We wanted to prioritise really getting your view. So that's a really brief overview of our roles. I'm going to hand over now to my colleagues, starting with Paul, to go through a bit more detail, get to some specifics around that, and invite your comments and feedback. So I'll click on for you, Paul, and hand over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everyone. I'm Paul Campbell. I'm the Leadership Fellow for Cheshire and Merseyside ICS region. I also happen to be the Cppo for Merseycare at the minute. And just to give you a very brief synopsis of the current state of play of Cppos, it's a role that's been going probably for about a year and a half now, but it's definitely still in its infancy. regard. So, for example, we don't know who all the Cppos are. And indeed, when I took up my current post in Merseycare, I sort of had a chat with the people around me at my level and sort of went, well, who's the Cppo? I guess it would be me. Is that right? We're trying to get our heads around what a Cppo is. So, for example, there's no job description for a Cppo. And that's not because they're not needed or this wasn't well thought through. It's because it's a developing role. And just like people, we're trying, part of this role is about us getting our heads around how we support Cppos and tell them what they should be doing, who their Cppos should be, and that type of almost like a job description or job role for a Cppo. What we want to do is help the Cppos to understand what they should be doing and what we want them to be doing. So about this time last year, there was a survey of Cppos. If you bear with me, I'll try and get my clicker working. That's it. There was a survey of Cppos. Now, this was around May last year. And bearing in mind that Cppo was even more in its infancy, it was in its, it wasn't even an infant back then, it was a newborn. And not many Cppos were in place. Organisations were just getting their heads around having Cppos. But those people who were identified as Cppos or the most senior psychological professionals in their organisations were asked to rank the things that they wanted to focus on, they thought they should be focusing on. And they ranked them in the following way. And the thing they'll set the context in this is, this was last May 2020, and we all remember what was going on then. And this the pandemic very much flavoured the responses to this survey. So it was supporting the well-being of NHS organisations, teams and staff was the top ranked issue for Cppos. It was a very difficult time for staff working from home, moving to working from home and doing this type of work from home. And if you think about some of the clinical work that people were doing, it was quite difficult for them to get their heads around that. And that moving on to that second issue that Cppos ranked was remote delivery of psychological therapies. Third most important issue to them was maintaining a psychological approach to prevention, care and treatment. Fourth was keeping psychological services and psychological therapies open through the immediate crisis. Those of us working in things like IAPT and primary care psychological therapies, there was a very real threat of us being told to close and send our staff to the wards to help keep wards open. So that was quite a live issue this time last year, or 18 months ago. It's not so much an issue now. In that very quickly we found out that psychological therapies was the front line of mental health in the pandemic. And fifth area that they wanted to focus on was maintaining psychological professions training programs. Again, over the last few years, there's been quite a bit of debate into how those training programs should be rolled forward, how they should be funded, things like that. So those are the main issues, top 5 issues that were rated by the Cppos back then. The key areas that they wanted to focus on, so the types of tasks that they would do or the approach they would take was that they felt they had a role in supporting others, so managers, families, teachers, everyone whose work or life comes into contact with a psychological professional, and those people who are managing psychological professionals. Their second main area of focus, they said, was disseminating information and resources. Third was recruitment and retention of staff and having an involvement in things like workforce planning that Gita mentioned earlier. And fourth was solving problems that came up and that sort of strategic decision making in their organisations. So that's what they thought they should focus on this time last year. I pinched these slides from the Cppo webinar this time last year. So I'm not presenting this either with their permission or with their endorsement that this is the current thinking among Cppos. I just wanted to give you a flavour of what they were thinking. There may well be another poll this year that is a bit more up to date, or that will be happening. It's a bit more up to date. But more importantly, what I wanted to do was, given that we've got so many of you gathered here today, I wanted to get your views on what you think those issues should be. So we have an idea of what Cppos want and the type of approach that they think they should be taking. Remember that a lot of this will be based on their discussions with colleagues, but also on their own thinking and histories and their own organisations. So what I wanted to do was get people's opinions on what you as a psychological professional want your Cppo to be concentrating on over the next year. So we'll in a moment we'll do a Slido poll, and the question that we're asking you, we'll come to the question in a second, but we want you to keep your answers to under 25 words. The reason for this is we're going to take these away and analyse the results, and what we want is you to put a bit of thinking into what it is you want the Cppos to be working on. You can put as many answers as you want, but just try and keep them succinct, under 25 words. And what we'll do is we'll analyse these for themes, and we'll look at the things that you want Cppos to work on, and then that's what we'll pass along to them. That's what we'll use almost to define a work plan for our Cppos and over the next year. Obviously, this won't have any official clout in that we can't go to them and say this is definitely a work plan for the next year, but I would like to think that it has some ethical, moral and clout, that if Cppos are representing psychological professionals, a poll of those psychological professionals and what they want them to do is a pretty valid poll in my opinion. So I would imagine the Cppos will be very, very interested to learn what it is you want them to do on your behalf. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind bringing up the Slido. Yeah, so here's the question. Using 25 words or less, what issues would you like your Cppo to be prioritising over the next year with regards to the leadership of psychological professions? And if you wouldn't mind, I see people are answering already. That's absolutely brilliant. I'll give you about a minute of silence to think about it. But what I would say is, would you try and avoid acronyms, because we're quite fond of acronyms. So I see EDIs coming up. It'd be lovely to know what that is. So I'll be quiet for a minute and let you think and type. So that's about a minute now. Feel free to keep typing. I believe the poll will stay open for a while. We might come back to it in the discussion section and talk a bit more about what's coming up. Just so you know that the word art that we're doing, the most frequently talked about issues on that poll will come up as the big words in the middle. So it looks like career progression, staff well-being are up there and important. So feel free to type into that at some point today. And now I'll hand you over to Dale, who's the third leadership fellow here in the Northwest.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. Please feel free to type away as I speak. I'm Dale Huey. My day job, I guess, is to provide some leadership to the IAPT and other psychological therapy provision in half of Greater Manchester, so Manchester, Wigan, Salford, Bolton and Trafford. And I'm delighted in the other bit of my role to be the Regional Leadership Fellow for Greater Manchester. So Estelle described earlier on some issues about the key vision for Cppos and some of the central responsibilities. Rachel's talked to you a little bit about how the deliverables or what the responsibilities for our role as the 3 leadership fellows in the Northwest are. And Paul's, I guess, asking and hopefully you're given for your views in terms of what you want from your Cppos, that we can help communicate and make sure that there's some sort of mapping of what the objectives are on these more senior roles. I guess what I'm really doing is just asking you how you would like to hear about what we're doing and how you would like to let us know what you think needs doing within the leadership in general for psychological professions. What you're looking at on the screen is a borrowed from Health Education England, and is a kind of typical way of representing different communication methods. So on the y-axis, you've got the idea that you've got breadth of influence, and on the x-axis, you've got the idea of degree of interest, and that is then split into quadrants. So you could have people with low influence, low interest, and you could have people with the opposite, so high interest and high influence. What I'd like you to do is kind of thinking through in terms of your own preferences and actually what you think the important issues are, is to consider really how you would like to both inform us and be informed. So if I just move on to the next one. And I'm very conscious that, we're in this role in the Northwest, and leadership fellow roles may well develop in other regions, but have a different brief. So I'm kind of asking from your personal and professional perspective, and on behalf of your colleagues or people in similar roles and professions, to think about kind of personally what you think would be the most effective way to receive information, and how you would like to provide information to leadership fellows, how you'd like to let us know what you think needs to happen, and what method you'd like us to use to communicate with people of high influence who either have a high interest already in psychological professions or the provision of psychological informed care, or people who have low interest but have high influence. So if Matt, you could let people answer those questions now. I'm going to try and leave on the screen while you do answer the questions. I suppose a bit of a bluffer's guide to communication, a kind of a key to the questions or an overview. So push methods are typically things which you could think of as, you didn't ask for it, but you received it, whether it's a flyer through the door or, it's an email or regular reports or films that you receive access to, and verbal memos or lectures. So it's one direction. There's no expected response, at least not, initially. And it's usually written, although not always. So pull methods are more kind of requires you to take some action to access or get information. So, you may well be informed where to find things, or you may know already. But things like websites, SharePoint, webinars, shared drive, dashboards, you need to go and receive that information so you kind of managing yourself what you read and what you look at. There's various ways of categorizing interactive methods of communication, but I've separated these off to consultation methods, which are, is, I guess, actively seeking, or us actively seeking, then taking account of the views of whichever group of stakeholders we're interacting with. And that would be almost a Blue Peter, or here's one I made earlier kind of model, where the function of that consultation really is to finalize or shape or model, say, for example, implementing a plan. So communication methods around meetings of special interest groups, forums, open days, surveys, are aligned or capable of serving that kind of function. Much more collaborative or participative methods involve mutual listening, joint definition of problems and issues, and a collective design of a strategy, a plan, or a solution. So, you know, traditional meetings that aren't very agenda heavy, working groups, executive committees, communities of practice, etc. So there are some examples on there, and I'm not sure if I've talked long enough for you to answer the questions. So I'll just leave you with a few seconds to complete that. Matt, is there a way of showing how many responses we've got coming through yet? Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I think we've got 11, if I'm reading that correctly, and kind of a reasonable split. Ooh, up to 14. This is live and interactive. Thank you. People are continuing to respond there. Okay. So if we can, anybody who wishes to respond, please do continue to do that. And we'll have we're going to have some time for questions. We're going to move on to that in a moment, and there'll be an opportunity to review what the, I guess, overarching results are that kind of come through from your perspective. So thanks very much for taking some time to do that. I think I can hand back to Estelle or Gita now.
Okay, thanks, Dale. So this is now over to me, and I think that really means it's over to you. We've had a great number of a few questions in the chat, which I'm happy for us to pick up on. And if there's any more comments or questions, then please do, keep them coming. And obviously, in terms of the polls for Dale and Paul, please do continue to add your thoughts and add your views on that one as well. So I think just while that's kind of continuing, I know we had a couple of questions earlier on, which is about how do we include the new psychological professions in the newer psychological professionals in leadership development. And I hope some of the presentations today have given you some ideas about that, in particular the mentoring scheme. I think one of the things that we're keen to do is to hear from people within the network about how that could best work. But I'm also conscious that I think certainly if I can bring Estelle in, if you've got some thoughts from your point of view from the Cppo presentation.
Thanks, Gita. Yeah, so the question, just to clarify, was around how could we get people involved in a little earlier. Is that the question? Sorry,
Yeah.
Was that the question from
some
the
of
chat?
the people in the newer psychological professions where leadership opportunities are perhaps less well established than for some of the longer standing professions?
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important question, actually, isn't it? So I think it does come back to one of the roles in terms of the Psychological Professions Network, which is around, I suppose, bringing people together. One of the things that it's resonating for me in terms of starting, being involved in setting up the PPN in London is making sure we reach all the different professions. And I've just noted that the bid for additional professions, people are wanting to be included, which is wonderful. So how do we get them included? I guess there's something really important about sharing what is happening and sharing in a way that people feel inspired to join in and see the benefit of joining up. And I think that key idea of inform and inclusion, informing and being inclusive was something that you brought right at the beginning of this session. How reaching out. I'm just very, very taken with Paul's pulling and pushing as a way of getting information. It is sometimes difficult at the moment to reach out to people and not be an additional burden and a burden of requiring information. Reaching out in a way that inspires people to come to the table and join in and not feel as if there's extra information required. That's one thing. But also, I guess when you hear people speak about their inclusion early on, I think that's a real lesson we could take away, perhaps, about inspiring people to feel confident. Because I think confidence in leadership is something that I guess will be on a number of programs in terms of learning and development for a range of psychological professions, but is key. It came out in that film particularly, I think, as being critical to what we need in the future. There's a couple of thoughts to share. I don't know if they ring true in your experience as a more established leader, Geeta, in your region, but I'm just thinking, yeah, just a couple of thoughts to share at the beginning.
Okay, thanks, Estelle. So I guess there was a couple of other points in terms of linked to that, which is around how do people who are aspiring psychological professions actually get opportunities around experience. And I'm certainly aware that Health Education England have set up some programs around aspiring paid experience. Estelle, you're nodding vigorously, so I'm wondering whether I should just hand over to you if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, yeah, so one of the other HEE funded schemes this year has been the Aspire programme, so it's very suitably named. We've in the London region, again, we've been really sort of trying to get behind this and setting that up across a number of trusts. So we've the term Aspire to wanting to be finding a way in, and of course some of our structures have been prohibitive to people who might have felt, well, I haven't got a first, or I'm not going to be not somebody that would be selected to join this profession. So we're, in terms of widening access, we've been doing a lot of work, and this is where HEE has pitched this particular programme in terms of funding to widen access and allow opportunities for people to join in from an earlier stage and to learn a little bit about what being an assistant psychologist might be like, and to give that opportunity to many more people. So the teams, the trusts across the London region, and I can only speak for them, I guess, have worked really hard to set that up, and we've expanded it again with the funding from this year. So what does that involve? That involves introducing selecting a different selection process, a lot of work from teams to really think about how do we reach out to people who are more representative of our local communities, and make it possible for people to join us. And I guess the proof will be in the pudding. As a bit further down the line, we'll see the impact of some of these schemes on our workforces. And as you said, it's a complex picture, because it isn't always as simple as it sounds to understand completely what the workforce looks like. But it's one of the Cppo responsibilities in a region to have to work on that knowledge and have a good sense of what the diversity across the professional roles is. So yeah, the Aspire programme is an exciting initiative, and I'm really hopeful that we will certainly had a very high level of engagement with that, and hopeful that we will see the benefits a bit further down the line. I don't know if that answers your question quite, Geeta, because I'm sure there are Aspire programmes in all the regions, aren't there? So you may wish to
are they're
add
developing. Yeah, so thanks, Estelle. And I think we've picked up one other comment on this, which I'll just pick up before we move on to something else, which is so it's saying the mentoring program is great, but maybe only a start to get a really diverse workforce. We need to get to all universities and schools. So how do we do that? And I think one thing I will say is certainly we've had some initial input into careers fairs for people in their kind of probably GCSE and onwards years, certainly in the Northwest, and we've been asked to sort of contribute to that in a more sort of national footprint. So I think that's also a real opportunity. And I think the other thing is also you'll certainly hear more about it on Wednesday in terms of some of the new roles, and I'd strongly encourage you to let young people you may know come along to those sessions as a way of actually sharing that world as well. So I think just in terms of moving on slightly, there was a couple of points I wanted to pick up, which is one of the comments early on was in a lot of physical health and acute trusts, psychological professions are often isolated and relatively junior. So can they still be chief psychological professions officers? And I think the other thing was also a recognition of the need to work with social care in terms of mental health cannot be seen in isolation of the wider social and community issues. So I think this is probably something I'm quite keen to ask the leadership fellows for their views on in terms of that engagement and how we create networks across a range of organisations, because I think being collective has amplified our voice as psychological professionals rather than as individual psychological professions. So I don't know which of the leadership fellows would like to sort of comment first, but I'm just thinking I'll start with Rachel, because Rachel started your presentation. That's okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, I sneakily got in there my neuropsychology title, so I certainly have my eye on the physical health world. And it's true, I think colleagues working in physical health and acute settings, they are fewer in number. They're quite often less senior. So I think you're quite right, Geisha, in what you said, really. It's about establishing those networks and being really inclusive in thinking across not only different psychological professions, but the settings as well, and making sure we've really mapped those out really carefully, and we come back then to the communication strategy and how vital that is. Yeah, it's important.
Thanks, Rachel. So Paul, you were next, just in the order of presentations. So I'm only going that because you can't wave at me and tell me you'd rather come in, Dale. So,
yeah, I suppose what I would say with regards to sort of who can become Cppos and what type of leaders we have, if you think about even 2-3 years ago, if you said who are the what are the psychological professions in the NHS, people would say, "Oh, you mean psychologists?" And you look even with the now that we have the outline 12, maybe after today 13 psychological professions actually listed. The hope is that will start to make people feel like part of an umbrella family, and certainly in the NHS. Posts like ours, and for example, trusts like ours, Merseycare, which is a pretty big trust, has bought into this national vision of psychological professions, that that it's an umbrella term, and it includes a whole range of people, right through from us very old-fashioned clinical psychologists to our practitioners, our psychological well-being practitioners, people like that. So I suppose that's encouraging to me. Is in the last 2 or 3 years we've come quite a bit, and hopefully in the next 5 or 10 we'll go even further and make sure that we are a family that isn't a patriarchy or a hierarchy.
Thanks, Paul. Dale?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, and in the early stages, we've already discovered the relevance of it, really, because I think that even some quite large organisations in the northwest of England, for example, don't have somebody in a position of leadership, however it's badged. However, whether it's trust lead or kind of senior psychologist, or there's not somebody in a position really where they've got anywhere near board level leadership responsibility. Even the 2 or 3 or 4 steps below that are actually don't really only have leadership within a team, and it's hugely relevant. And there's a number of other provider organisations, both NHS and NHS commissioned services, that deliver psychological care where there isn't anybody really in a senior leadership role. Now, I mean, this isn't in consultation with anybody, but what I'm kind of hoping we can do is for the organisations that do have a Cppo in Greater Manchester or in the Northwest in general, when we've got that network in place, we can really kind of have almost satellites to that network, to all provider organisations. So that'll do 2 things, I think. The most senior psychological professions in those organisations will have a route through to if you like, Cppos for their region or for their STP or ICS area, but also the 2-way communication back to provider organisations implicitly and explicitly gives a message without telling anybody you need to have one of these. It, I suppose, shines a light on the importance of having psychological leadership and the potential benefits of that.
Thanks, Dale. And I guess the other thing, just I suppose picking up on the other point around needing to work with wider stakeholders. It's not just about sort of mental health. Is there anyone that would like to comment on that or come in on that? I'm happy to say something, but I don't want to hold the floor. So, given the fact I can see you now, if you want to just wave, then we'll go straight to you. No waves. So I think I absolutely agree we need to work with social care and public health and primary care and the acute sector and a whole wide range of people. And I think one of the key things about the psychological professions networks is that they're not intended to be purely about mental health, and they're intended to be inclusive of all psychological professionals. So just, I suppose, as an example, certainly our health psychologist colleagues did quite a lot of work in the pandemic in terms of linking in with public health departments and looking at some of the messaging around pandemic messages, whether they're lockdown messages or vaccination messages. And I think that sort of reflects the range of work that psychological professions can offer. And so, yeah, absolutely. This is not purely about mental health. This is a much wider approach to sort of psychological work. And I think one of the things that's certainly key from what we've learned from the feedback on things around a long-term plan and around NHS services in general is people want more access to psychological approaches. So I think, and then the other thing I also picked up was there was a question earlier on is how do we avoid duplication of ideas and themes at local levels? And I suppose my initial response to that is, well, it's kind of okay really, because if we're all starting to develop a shared vision and a shared understanding, there'll probably be a potential different flavour, whether you're in Newcastle or Newquay or, you know, somewhere else that rhymes with an N that I can't actually think of. And I think that's kind of important because I think some of the theories I suppose I've looked at in the past around large-scale change is it involves, if we're going to change the system or change how people think about psychological professions and what we do, we often have lots and lots of things which can appear sort of repetitious, but they're all about getting that message in there. And I think, you know, so is it duplication or is it sharing good ideas and adopting good ideas from other areas? So I don't know if anyone else would like to add to that as I have a quick look to see what else is coming in. Dale, and then Estelle.
I mean, just to reiterate it really, because I think sometimes I totally understand the point, and I think there is a, you know, with new professions, new roles, new strategies and directives, so there is a risk of that. But in many ways, I think anything that creates momentum or creates increased visibility of some of the needs for improved psychological care, we can work with and use. And I think that in theory, if we can develop the regional networks at that SCP ICS area, then we can harness all of the ideas or the directives or the needs that are potentially coming from different groups, different sources, different stakeholders, but it can help create momentum.
So, Dale, seeing as you're here in front of me at the moment, the next question is, can the panel say something about what psychological professions can offer to the integrated care systems struggling with the overall workforce challenge in the NHS? And I know you've started to touch on that, so I wondered if you wanted to say any more.
I think there's two things I think to say about that. The first thing, and I'm conscious Estelle wanted to come in a moment, and she may say more from a London perspective, but I'm very conscious of sometimes the importance of having the mandate to be able to challenge people. You know, colleagues from other professions with other mandates kind of will often come up with very good solutions or the best solutions that they can come up with without necessarily knowing how those solutions could be enhanced by, you know, a greater focus on psychological delivery of care or psychological professions. So I think that would be the first thing I would say. I'm trying to not say anything controversial, but sometimes you just have to have people in a position to say, well, actually, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And my typical experience of leadership in the psychological professions has been, if I've had to say that of somebody, you know, the people who've gone before, I've watched do that, it's often been at the 11th hour when a lot of our operational or other clinical colleagues have put a lot of work into developing plans or strategies going forward. So I think it's really important that we have that level. And I think the ICS STP areas offers a real opportunity to move away from the traditional structure within provider organisations. You have to have a medical director and have to have a nursing director, but don't have to have a director of psychological professions. And whilst psychological professions are represented really wonderfully by some of our colleagues from other professions, people, to not put a too fine a pointer on it, don't know what they don't know, and sometimes actually have active competing demands that aren't necessarily in line with the increased delivery of psychologically informed or trauma-informed care. So I think that move offers a massive opportunity to influence at that level. And for those of us kind of old enough to remember, it's almost a kind of, in my mind, a move back to that regional health authority structure, where instead of that purchaser provider kind of split, or commissioners and providers, you've got an opportunity to work with colleagues. We've got the same interests in mind, efficient, effective, safe, equitable, person-centered care for their regions, and to be able to demonstrate how we can do that, how we can solve problems as a group of professionals, as a group, as a separable group of health and social care providers, how we can solve problems. And by we, there needs to be enough we on the ground. So I think, that kind of getting involved in workforce development is a really important element of that.
Okay, so I'd like to bring Estelle in now, because I know she wants to come in.
Thank you, Geeta. And Dale, I do agree. And I'd almost lost my train of thought on the previous question, but can I just winding back a tiny bit, if it's okay, to the question which I thought was a really good one about, what about if there's just we're all doing similar things and it gets a little bit muddly. And I think it's a really helpful reflection, actually, because I think what it put me in mind of was, I suppose, our response to the pandemic, in that and particularly around well-being, which is one of the things that Cppos had been associated with in terms of how can we show leadership there for the psychological professions. The pandemic's thrown up all sorts of well-being opportunities for people, and as just thinking about, well, what is actually helpful. What I think we've learned is that we're all in choppy seas, in different boats, and actually having sort of some leadership and oversight and celebration of the fact that there are different ways of approaching things, and that we're all different in our different boats about how we might what our needs might be, actually helps us to celebrate the fact that there is that difference, and not worry about it too much. Obviously not to be elbowing each other around, but just certainly that's okay. And I guess that's something of the feeling to join the two strains of thought up around as we move towards integrated care systems, and that there are as people are setting up boards and establishing who's on them and whether psychological professions are present or not, there is that sort of sense of, are we at the table, are we there, the newness of it all being unsettling and slightly anxiety provoking. But coming together, I guess, means that we and joining forces means that we would find a unified voice. And I think that's a key lesson, both from the pandemic, because where we've broken down those boundaries and worked together, we've clearly come up with much better wellbeing resources for staff, and also we've supported one another, and hopefully we can do the same as we move forwards with developments, joining up a network of Cppos within regions and nationally. So I'm not saying that answers any question, but I just think there's some threads of golden threads of possibility that we can hold on to.
Thanks, Estelle. So, conscious of time, but we've probably still got probably 2-3 minutes before we definitely need to wind up. So Paul wants to come in, so over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Geeta. It was just on that question about what psychological professions can do for those workforce problems in other areas, non-psychological professional areas. And I think that's our key skill. And if you look at the 5 key areas in the national vision, the one to make all health and care psychological. The reason that we're doing that isn't because we're advocates for psychology, it's because psychological health and care works. It works better for patients, it works better for staff, it makes life easier for the people delivering the healthcare interventions and those receiving them, and makes for a much nicer relationship, which hopefully will be less stressful for staff. And one of the reasons we know we've lost some of our workforce is because of the stress that they're under. If you look at some of the surveys that come out during the pandemic, NHS staff had something like 10% higher rates of PTSD and twice as much anxiety and depression as the general population. And when we make health and care psychological, we make it easier. We make it more pleasant to receive and to deliver. So I think that's what we can bring, as well as if you look at the resilience hubs that have been set up and the wellbeing hubs all around the country, that's about bringing psychological thinking to traditionally non-psychological services. And the reason isn't because we like psychology, it's because it works.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Rachel, do you want to have a couple of words before we finish things off?
Yeah, just very briefly, something I was thinking about. So I have another ICS remit role as a clinical lead for stroke, and it's just to add really that what I think, thinking about that same question about what leadership fellows can offer to the ICS, it's around thinking across trust boundaries for me as well. So I totally agree with Dale around early involvement in conversations at that general level as well as around specific roles. But it does, fingers crossed, hopefully allow us that potential to think across traditional trust boundaries, to have much greater kind of reach, I guess, in terms of our leadership. And that's for me, a really great opportunity for the stroke work I'm doing. And I see how that could also work for us as leadership fellows as well.
Thanks. So thanks to everyone. And I think we've probably got one final slide before we kind of start finishing off today. And I guess that there's not really more that I want to add. I think we've had a very full and rich conversation about, the world of sort of psychological professions, how we're trying to inform, enable and influence across the country and in different ways. And I think today's been a snapshot. We couldn't include everyone, but there was a lot of rich work kind of going on. And I think in terms of sort of over the rest of this week, please do join. You'll learn more about new roles. You'll learn more about what's going on in different regions. And I think all those things can contribute to networking as we go forward. So I think if we can go to the final slide, Matt, if that's all right. Yeah. So we've got 3 evaluation questions, which are now in the Slido window. And if you could go, please submit your feedback just by clicking the option that you prefer and hitting submit. Very short, won't take a second. And then if you'd like to download your certificate of attendance for this session, there's a button underneath the stream window. And please make sure you download your certificate before you leave. It's not going to be around for a long time. So I don't think there's anything else to say. I'd just like to thank everyone that's contributed on the day. And I'd certainly like to thank our mentees for sharing their very powerful experiences of mentoring and how that's made a difference. And so hope you enjoyed this session and hope to see you again later this week. Thank you very much.